Today's a great victory. It's a great victory for Sean Combs. It's a great victory for the jury system. You saw that the Southern District of New York prosecutors came at him with all that they had. They're not stopping, but one thing stands between all of us and a prison, and that is a jury of 12 citizens.
The courtroom, once a place of calculated order and procedure, now resembled the epicenter of an unfolding storm. Cameras flashed, reporters jostled for position, and an uneasy silence fell whenever Diddy's lawyer took the stand.
Okay, we're about to do something that we've never done here on Sidebar. For a show that has covered every aspect of Sean Diddy Combs' criminal case, we are about to speak with one of his defense attorneys, Alexandra Shapiro. She is part of his legal team at trial. And the trial, by the way, that ended with Combs acquitted of the most serious charges: racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking. He was convicted of 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. They call these the Mann Act violations, moving women and men across state lines for the purposes of commercial sex work. Now, we have talked about Alexandra Shapiro before. She was the attorney, for example, who argued for admitting that video of rape accuser Mia wishing Combs a happy birthday after the alleged assault. She played a key role in this case. And with questions about could Combs' convictions be thrown out, what could he be sentenced to, will he make bail before he's sentenced, can he get a presidential pardon, this feels like a great opportunity to get some insight into all this and certain aspects of the trial, like why didn't they call Christina Coram? All right, so let me get right into it. I am joined right now by Alexandra Shapiro herself. Thank you so much for taking the time to come here on Sidebar. We really, really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I have a lot of things I want to get into. We will talk about all the latest developments. But first of all, I got to ask, what was it like to be part of a team like this one? Because you know, every argument, every question, it is going to be focused, debated, on a national, maybe an international stage. This is a major case. And also, by the way, you were representing somebody and are representing somebody who for the past 2 years has taken quite a hit in the media and wasn't the most popular figure in the last 2 years. So to be representing Sean Combs in this massive trial, what was it like for you?
I mean, it was actually an amazing experience. First of all, the team was fantastic. I mean, I've never worked with so many great lawyers with different talents meshing together. And it was great after I've been working on this case since last September, dealing with the client being just bashed in the media, bashed by a ton of frivolous civil lawsuits that just sort of whipped up the hysteria against him. It was great to finally be able to help him have his day in court. And so the actual witnesses could be heard, and we had a chance to really expose a lot of the truth of what was really behind all of this.
Obviously, this is a win, right? He was acquitted of the most serious charges that he was facing. Did there ever become a time, though, during the course of the trial, maybe in the first several weeks, when you're like, I'm a little nervous, I think he may get convicted of racketeering or sex trafficking, or you were confident throughout the prosecution's case that they just weren't reaching their burden?
Well, we felt good about the trial most of the time and we're confident, but you never can be too confident in a federal criminal trial. I mean, especially in the Southern District of New York, the government almost always wins, and it's a huge challenge and really, really difficult to win. So we were always concerned. There were points where it seemed to.
The weight of the announcement was felt in every corner of the room. The revelation that Diddy could walk free was not whispered or hinted at. It was stated bluntly, publicly, and with undeniable conviction. The atmosphere was electric, with every observer trying to grasp the full magnitude of what had just been said. The procedural errors laid bare by Diddy's defense team were unlike any typical legal misstep. These weren't minor omissions or clerical mistakes. They were fundamental breaches of protocol, cases where search warrants had been improperly issued, timelines that contradicted themselves, and forensic evidence handled without due chain of custody. Legal analysts explain that in a case this high profile, such errors were almost unheard of, especially when the prosecution was so confident in its position just weeks earlier. Multiple key witnesses recanted under oath. Several who had initially presented damning statements against Diddy later claimed they had been pressured or coerced into providing false testimonies. One witness, whose identity
Defense's argument? Was the defense's argument, hey, all the people who testified against Sean Combs were not being truthful, or we're taking their accounts, we're listening to their accounts, and what they're saying just didn't amount to a federal crime? Is it a mixture of both? Just trying to understand what the argument was.
I mean, I think it was a mixture. It depended on the witness. And a lot of the witnesses were telling the truth, but the truth didn't hurt Sean. It helped him. There were some people who were shading the truth. The great thing about it was there was a ton of evidence in written communications that people had created at the time, all these text messages. There were videos, and that really helped us expose the truth, because these were things that had been recorded this is what people were, the girlfriends, others were saying to Sean at the time of the events in question. And so, there was really no way for the witnesses or the government to hide what was in the written documents.
Now, I will tell you, if you had been following what we've been doing here on Sidebar, Law and Crime, we call balls and strikes. So there were, during the course of the trial, we would say, this was the strength of the prosecution, this was the strength of the defense. There was such effective cross-examination of these key witnesses that we all kind of wondered, was the defense going to call any witnesses? And you really did. And what was that decision? Because I understand there were witnesses who were planning to be called. There was an idea to put forward a defense case. There was a choice to not to do that. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what that strategy was about?
Sure. I mean, you always have to be ready to put on a case. At the end of the day, what it comes down to at the end of the government's case is how well do you feel it went in for us? And it's always risky to put on a defense case. People don't realize that, but there's always two sides to everything. And if you put on a witness, and even if it's, 70% good, if the prosecution scores some points, it can really undermine you. And so if you feel like the government's case has gone in really well for you, it can be actually riskier to call any witnesses. People don't necessarily realize that. But at the end of the day, we just made a decision that we thought the case had come in well, and we didn't want to, sort of change the dynamic in a way that could be risky for us.
Was Christina Coram ever potentially going to be called by the defense? We were all shocked why the government never chose to call her, since, I don't know, her name came up almost every single day through almost every witness. Was there a plan by the defense to call her?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to get into specific plans or non-plans, but it was more of an overall decision just not to put anyone on and just to use a few pieces of evidence that hadn't come in.
What do you think about the prosecution's choice not to call her? Because I will tell you, we did lunchtime shows, live shows with our audience. I would say 80% of the questions that we got during 7 weeks of testimony was, why is she not being called and will she be called? Were you surprised the prosecution chose not to call who was supposed to be the main alleged co-conspirator?
I mean, I don't think so. I think that she would have been a double-edged sword for them, and they probably didn't want to take the risk. As you saw during the trial, even a number of the witnesses that they had always planned to call, that they did put in, kind of blew up in their faces or had positive things to say about Sean that maybe they weren't anticipating. And so
he was heavily protected due to fear of retaliation, disclosed in a sworn affidavit that investigators had implied threats against family members if they refused to comply. The credibility of the prosecution, once thought unshakable, began to crumble. The media frenzy surrounding Diddy intensified exponentially. Social media exploded with every revelation. A single tweet from a major entertainment outlet declaring, "Diddy's lawyer drops bombshell, could walk free soon," garnered millions of interactions within hours. Influencers, celebrity gossip channels, and political pundits debated the legitimacy of the claims, dissecting every word of the lawyer's statement, every nuance of the court proceedings. News outlets interrupted regular programming to deliver live coverage. Every headline was now about Diddy's potential release rather than his alleged crimes. Legal experts on every network weighed in, some calling the possibility.
Continue. Cassie Ventura and Sean Combs went to swingers clubs and they had threesomes. Miss Ventura consistently expressed interest and enthusiasm in her intimate life with Combs, including what they called freak-offs. Jane and Sean Combs had threesomes too. When Jane and Combs watched pornography together, Jane testified that she contacted two different porn stars and invited them to join her and Mr. Combs. Both Miss Ventura and Jane testified that very often they would see the same men over and over again for years. In July of 2024, Jane testified, for instance, that she suggested to Mr. Combs that they call Paul. Jane explained that she told Combs she, quote, missed Paul. When asked why she said that, she responded, because I did. This was a lifestyle, one that both Miss Ventura and Jane chose, one they all, as grown adults, had a right to choose. Like many aspects of sex and intimacy, it was not without its complications, its bouts of jealousy, and at times, its frustrations. But that is a hallmark of any serious romantic relationship, and that is what these were, serious, long-term romantic relationships. By the way, not surprising they're really focusing on this because, again, he was acquitted of sex trafficking. They highlight how the jury didn't find sex trafficking of Jane or Cassie, that it didn't occur. There was no force, fraud, or coercion that was used to induce these women to engage in commercial sex acts. For transportation to engage in prostitution, what he was convicted of, the prosecution didn't have to prove that violence was used or that fraud was used or threats were used. It was just, did you transport these women and men for the purposes of sex work, commercial sex acts? And obviously the jury convicted him of that. And they highlight all the jury found was that there was prostitution, payment of porn stars and escorts. And they highlight that he is a swinger, or under the Mann Act, a John. And they argue he doesn't deserve to be locked up for this. Quote, Sean Combs should not be in jail for this conduct. In fact, he may be the only person currently in a United States jail for being any sort of John, and certainly the only person in jail for hiring adult male escorts for him and his girlfriend when he did not even have sex with the escort himself. Over the last 75 years, the White Slave Traffic Act has been limited to defendants who cause interstate travel for financial gain through the business of prostitution. That Sean Combs remains in jail for being convicted of being a customer of consensual adult sex services makes this case truly exceptional. Not only is prosecuting the users of adult prostitution services inconsistent with the Mann Act, it's inconsistent with the prosecution policies of the district attorneys of Manhattan and the city attorney of Los Angeles, California, two of the three locations where this prostitution allegedly took place. In addition, Mr. Combs is incarcerated while everyone else involved in this identical conduct, his girlfriends, the cowboys, the agency leaders, the porn stars, and others, walk free, as they should. If there was ever a fact pattern that was exceptional under the Mann Act, it is this one. And then they move on to another argument, that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, has usually only charged Mann Act violations when there's financial gain. And they even cite a number of cases in the Southern District of New York, where Combs was prosecuted, that apparently involved defendants that
ability of Diddy walking free a rare but plausible outcome, while others were more cautious, reminding viewers that legal battles of this magnitude rarely resolve overnight. They emphasize the complexity of appeals, counter motions, and procedural reviews that could stretch the timeline indefinitely. But no matter the caution, the public's fascination was insatiable. Pundits speculated about the implications far beyond the courtroom. What did this mean for Diddy's legacy? Could he recover from the damage done in the public eye? Some argued that if the court ruled in his favor, it would mark a triumphant comeback, one of the greatest in entertainment history. Others warned that the cloud of scandal would never fully dissipate, leaving a permanent stain on his reputation, regardless of the verdict. Public opinion remained sharply divided. Loyal fans flooded online platforms, defending Diddy, proclaiming their unwavering support, and accusing the system of attempting to destroy him. Justice for Diddy trended alongside the bombshell
that set up a prostitution business for profit. Again, trying to distinguish between Combs' conduct and these cases. He never did any of this for profit, they argued. And they even cite the 1953 U.S. Attorney's Manual that says, quote, as a general rule, prosecution should not be instituted in the so-called non-commercial cases. And they claim the Department of Justice manual today, quote, makes clear that the prosecution of customers involved in an 18 U.S.C. 2421 offense, like Mr. Combs here, is now limited to prosecuting those who engage in commercial sex with victims of sex trafficking, in addition to those who otherwise perpetrate or facilitate human trafficking offenses. And in the absence of any sex trafficking charge, however, it is clear that the standalone Mann Act counts never would have been prosecuted. That seems true. I think you ask any legal expert, They will say if all the government had against Sean Combs was the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, just the prostitution charges, they probably wouldn't have gone after him. They coupled it with racketeering and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that. Anyway, the defense highlights how modern day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no profit there, there's no profit here, there was sex trafficking of those prostitutes. That's what's different. Again, Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking in this case. And here's the main point, quote, moreover, the cases which involve defendants similarly situated to Mr. Combs have been released on bond pending sentencing. In reviewing the cases across the country where the primary or sole conviction was for a violation of 18 U.S.C. 2421, the defendants who were not charged with running a prostitution business have been released pending sentencing. And then Combs' attorneys make another argument for why Combs' conditions are exceptional. And it's about him being locked up at the MDC. They say that a district court judge in the Southern District in another case basically said how bad the MDC is. As Judge Furman noted, the state of affairs at MDC is unacceptable. In so noting, Judge Furman concluded that the conditions in the MDC qualify as exceptional reasons under the statute justifying, and this was the defendant in this case, Chavez's continuing release. Judge Furman found that the conditions at the MDC are, quote, dreadful in many respects, but three warrant particular emphasis. 1. Continued reports of inordinate periods of lockdown. 2. Claims that the facility provides inadequate and or substantially delayed necessary medical care, a particular risk in this case. And 3. General issues about the condition.
Announcement, as millions shared personal messages of solidarity and disbelief. Meanwhile, detractors labeled the revelations as yet another example of celebrity privilege and systemic corruption, suggesting Diddy's legal resources bought him a way out that ordinary defendants could never hope to access. The political implications were equally explosive. Some commentators began to tie the case to broader narratives about influence, power, and the intersection of celebrity and justice in modern America. Was this an isolated case? Or was it part of a larger pattern in which the ultra-wealthy wield the legal system as a shield? The notion that Diddy, a man whose music shaped entire generations, could manipulate his way out of prison became a cultural flashpoint. As the courtroom proceedings dragged on, the public watched every new document, every recanted testimony, every motion filed, as though it were the next act in an unfolding drama.
In relation to some of the charges where they found him not guilty. But, obviously they made their decision. They listened to the evidence. They saw all the exhibits and they made the decision that they did. And say come sentencing that Sean Combs is sentenced to maybe a couple years behind bars in prison. But do you think even after this trial, after everything that we've learned, after the many civil lawsuits that were also filed, do you think that there's any type of way that Sean Combs can have a comeback at this point?
Well, I think there's certainly a comeback that could be crafted and created in which we as the public may see. Listen, this is a person who has lived his life in the public light, in the limelight for decades, okay? And so, as has been said before, fame is one of the more addictive or most addictive drugs known to man. And so he was a very famous, and now some might say infamous person. The idea that he allows the narrative to end with the way in which the evidence came in and this kind of mixed bag verdict is not what's the word I'm looking for? If I don't see Diddy allowing the last chapter of his book to be written with this trial, instead, the person that he's held himself out to be and who we now understand him to be is someone who is going to say, look, this was a dark chapter in my life, but now I'm going to show you the phoenix rising from the ashes. And there are other chapters. And I think that he will make an even more concerted effort to be more philanthropic to be more of a victim's advocate. And also, once he completes these programs, he can say, look, I was once an abuser, abuser of women, abuser of drugs, abuser of fame, abuser of power and fortune, but look who I am now. And so I think that's a pretty powerful story. And frankly, people love comeback stories.
Yeah, they do love a good comeback story, but I'm curious, in your opinion, do you think that this is all just for maybe a showmanship, or do you think it's all for PR so that way, Diddy can walk out of MDC Brooklyn or possibly a potential prison and just be like, you know what, I am a changed person. But also in that same breath, what kind of message do you think that sends to victims out there who may have been abused, or something had happened to them by a high profile figure? They want to report this to police. They want to either go to maybe a civil lawyer, all of that stuff. But then after this trial, they are like, no, I can't do that. Look what happened in this case. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, there are definitely people who are victims advocates and victims themselves who think that this trial serves to kind of throw cold water, if you will, and chill victims who might want to come forward to express what happened to them, to initiate a criminal case, to initiate a civil case. They look at this case and say, at what cost is it to me personally to have to bare my soul, to only then be grilled on cross-examination, to have all of my intimate details bantied about, in the media, and then to be judged, and then go through all of that, and I walk away in some ways empty-handed. Now, that's certainly one way of looking at things, and there's a lot of credibility as it relates to understanding.
Each new development was met with either jubilation or outrage. The sheer unpredictability of it all kept everyone on edge. According to the lawyer, multiple factors had shifted the legal landscape dramatically. Key pieces of evidence previously thought to seal Diddy's fate were suddenly being called into question. Witnesses who once stood firm were now recanting their testimonies, alleging coercion and manipulation. Most explosive of all were revelations about procedural errors in the investigation, errors so severe that they could invalidate large portions of the case. The lawyer stood confidently in front of the cameras, delivering the news with an air of authority. Contrary to what the public has been led to believe, he said, our team has uncovered critical flaws in the prosecution's case. These flaws are not minor discrepancies. They go to the very heart of the investigation's integrity. He went on to explain that Diddy's legal team had filed multiple
criminal enterprise. The real thing was the mafia. The real thing was the organized crime surrounding the Corleone family, to use an example that everybody can probably relate to. So simply because their olive oil importing business was legitimate, that's not a defense to a RICO thing. That's the current state of the law. What they did here is they took a business that was always legitimate, Bad Boy Records, that was always and the purpose is to make music and make money. Everything surrounded that, and the defense argument, which they obviously argued very effectively, was that is not a criminal enterprise. So the very first element of RICO has always been problematic from the very beginning. You and I talked about that 2 months ago when this whole thing started, and and the jury, this was a sober jury that the questions were serious and direct, and they sent that note out regarding juror 25 right at the very beginning, saying, "Hey, this guy's not deliberating," and so this was a serious group, and the Mann Act, they did convict on that, so they were. By the fact that that it was unanimous meant that they were getting along. Federal juries tend to be, in California anyway, we have. They draw our state juries off the DMV database. That's how you get jury duty, is from the DMV. Federally, it's based on voter rules. So it's people who are conscientious enough to actually vote, and you tend to get a more serious class of juror in federal court, which I think is interesting. So to answer your question, it's something that we could kick around for years.
Sure.
But I think the fundamental problem here is that it was always kind of a misfit for a RICO theory. Just like the sex trafficking, sex trafficking requires fraud, force, or coercion, right? So that essentially is the same elements of rape. So you essentially, it's transporting somebody under circumstances that equate to rape. Is something forceful, something fearful. That it just doesn't fit very well here,
I
especially
get
when
it.
you're talking about all these
Yeah.
people they're orbiting him. They're all trying to advance their own career. And when when the defense attorney got up and said, um, Cassie got $30 million as a result of her settlement, right? And
Yeah.
that was a big move.
Yeah, I wasn't sold for that personally, because I was like, the prosecution came back and be like, she already settled. What's her incentive to come here and lie? You know, what's her incentive to be a part of this? And that for me, but I think the messages, the conduct that arguably contradicts someone being a victim, and I know there's complicated factors between an abuser and a victim, the trauma. I get it. I totally understand it, but I wonder if that's what saddled the jury. Okay, I want to move past the verdict because now we have to talk about what's happening next. First thing, when the sentencing hearing is going to happen. So they have this hearing next week about whether to expedite the sentencing, happening before October 3rd. If both sides agree, great. If they don't, what is a compelling legal argument for the defense to say, we want this sentencing to happen much sooner?
Well, I mean, we know that behind the scenes, what they want, of course, is they expect a chance that he's going to be released. So that's their big motivating factor.
Motions challenging the admissibility of key evidence, and that those motions were on the brink of being approved by the court. What made this revelation even more shocking was the timing. Just days after Diddy's explosive meltdown in court, when public opinion seemed to be stacked against him, the news flipped the script entirely. Suddenly, the narrative was no longer about an inevitable fall from grace. It was about a possible redemption. Social media erupted. Hashtags like hashtag Diddy Free Soon, hashtag Legal Bombshell, and hashtag Case Reversal began trending globally. Fans flooded Twitter and Instagram with expressions of disbelief and hope, while critics scrambled to analyze what this development meant. Was this the result of a genius legal strategy? An unexpected twist of fate? Or something more suspicious? Legal experts weighed in, with some calling it a rare but not impossible scenario in high-profile cases. They explained that if the court agreed with the motions, large portions of the prosecution's evidence could be thrown out, leaving the case dramatically weakened. Others warned that nothing was certain yet, and that appeals and counter-motions would likely follow, further complicating the battle. The media circus surrounding Diddy was already intense, but now it was on another level. Pundits speculated endlessly about what this could mean for the music mogul's future. Some predicted a total acquittal. Others suggested a plea deal was inevitable. Meanwhile, the public was divided. Loyal fans celebrated what they saw as a victory for justice. Critics remained skeptical, arguing that powerful people like Diddy always find a way out of trouble.
Factor, of course. Whether the court abides by that, I mean, it is a substantial change in circumstance. He was acquitted of all of these serious charges, right?
But he was
Like
just denied bail. He was denied bail again.
he was denied bail again, and I actually learned that on your segment yesterday afternoon as I was sort of
Yeah, yeah.
doing my preparation for this. But we have to remember that one of the things that he got in trouble for, that Diddy got in trouble for in jail, was using other inmates' calling number. Remember that? So he was calling witnesses in the case from jail using other inmates. That was a direct affront to that judge. That was remember, we had all those attempts at bail that were denied at the very beginning of the case, one after another after another. This judge, and it's the same judge who's going to sentence him, denied that over and over again. And you and I, again, in another conversation we had on your show, we both said he is screwed now, that he's got no chance because he's violating the rules of the court while in jail. So if he's disobeying the rules of the jail and the directive of the court while he's in custody, how can he be expected to actually follow the terms of a bail agreement when he's out of custody?
Right, right.
And I think that chicken is coming home to roost again. I mean, I think that's what happened yesterday afternoon. That any judge who has a criminal defendant who behaves like that, that is an affront to the court itself. It's disrespectful to the court. And it's almost like he couldn't get out of his own way there at the beginning. But he had an excellent defense team.
He does. He does. So assuming for a moment, whenever the sentencing hearing happens, right? Let's say it happens in a month from now. Let's say it has October 3rd. The question is, what's his sentence? As we mentioned, the prosecution in a filing from yesterday talked about the guidelines range being 51 to 63 months. Now, this is before a pre-sentencing investigation and report. Now, the defense, right, they want 21 months. He's already served almost 10. Talk to us about what you're thinking here, because there is no minimum. The maximum's 10. If the judge were to combine it together, like you said, 20 years, feels highly unlikely that would happen. As we're taught, what is a pre-sentencing report investigation? How would it affect this? What do you think the judge is going to do? There's so many different factors to consider here, and it's not like a murder case when it's like, okay, we know what's going to happen. It's like life in prison without the possibility of parole. It's a given. There's room here. What do you think the judge is going to do?
So in federal court, this is actually very interesting. They rely very heavily on those pre-sentencing investigations. So essentially, what will happen is there'll be a federal probation officer, and they do these for almost every case, where they will do their own investigation, where they'll talk to family members, they'll talk to employers, they'll talk to neighbors, and they will make a recommendation to the court as to suitability for release, suitability for time. And that's something that federal judges traditionally really adhere to. They tend to put a lot of weight on those, far more than they do in state court. The probation department can make a recommendation, but the DA will certainly have more ability, most of the time, to talk a judge in or out of a sentencing recommendation from the probation department. Federal court is different. They really put a lot of weight on those. So that's something that I think is going to be very interesting. And a lot of that will come down to what the individuals involved in that investigation, even though it shouldn't impact their professional recommendation. It's really, I think we're going to see what they thought of the case. Did they think he got away with something horrific here? Did they think that he was getting railroaded from the beginning? I think that may reflect in the recommendation to the court. But of course, we don't know what that is yet. I don't know. If I'm his defense lawyer, I'm kind of I don't know if I am pressing the gas on that, trying to make this thing go faster. I mean, it's coming up.
The question on everyone's lips became, how did it come to this? How could a case so seemingly airtight for the prosecution now be teetering on the brink of collapse? Speculation ran wild, with some insiders suggesting backroom deals, others pointing to undisclosed settlements, and a few theorizing about covert political pressure applied behind the scenes. One thing remained undeniable. The narrative had irrevocably shifted. What once seemed like Diddy's inevitable prison sentence had transformed into one of the most compelling stories of legal drama in recent memory. The possibility of his imminent release was no longer fringe speculation. It was a real, tangible possibility that could unfold in the coming weeks. As the world waits, the battle over Diddy's fate continues to escalate. With every new revelation, every counter-motion, every statement from his legal team, the drama deepens. The case is no longer simply about guilt or innocence. It is a reflection of the power dynamics in an age where fame, money, and influence collide with the justice system in the most unpredictable ways. The next few weeks are poised to redefine not just Diddy's legacy, but the very concept of celebrity accountability. And as millions of eyes remain glued to the unfolding saga, one thing is absolutely certain. The story of Diddy's potential freedom has only just begun.